We'll tie some of the stuff related to WWE and some of their inner workings when it comes to ownership into the story related to a certain former owner of a big company, one that was beating the WWE week in and week out, till a few years later they were completely out of business in WCW, and their owner, Ted Turner. Ted Turner passes away today. He is known to everyone, whether you like wrestling or not. I imagine I would say, hey, Ted Turner passed away, and most of the people I would say it to that are maybe a little bit older than myself, would have no idea he ever owned wrestling company, right? Turner Broadcasting, Turner TNT, obviously owner of the Braves, Atlanta Braves MLB team, just a huge media mogul in general. And as Vince McMahon said, got into the wrestling business and really made a go of it. Put Eric Bischoff at the helm, gave Eric Bischoff some TV time to go at it, and really tried his best to beat the WWE. But I think part of the fact that he's not a wrestling guy is then at the end of the day, he decided to listen to his advisors and other people I guess he just had a lot of stuff going on. So he kind of put some other people in charge of the wrestling aspect. And those people looked at it as a business and realized they're losing money, need to cut back here, need to cut back there. Eventually, they sell the place off.
Well, hold on. We got to stop there for just a second, because come on. So that's not 100% what the real story is. So essentially, if you listen to Eric Bischoff's podcast, Eric Bischoff would know better than you and I or anybody. Let's be honest. It wasn't Ted Turner specifically. Ted Turner, when he was the one, more so. I wouldn't say
I didn't say it was Ted Turner specifically. I said essentially that, like, Ted Turner, when he was involved, he was given.
Well, here's where I was going though. With Ted Turner though. So when he let the wrong people take over the business, take over that part of the operation, there was things, and I don't, I can't quote Eric Bischoff off the top of my head, but I do remember him talking about how some of those executives, frowned upon wrestling. And there was other properties that was under that umbrella that, that Turner owned that was losing money, but then they would stick it in. And this is the part where the losing money part is that's really not even that's not really a thing, to be honest with you. So what they would do is they would take losing properties, and it's like a creative accounting essentially. Mm-hmm. They have to do some, work some numbers and things like that. And they would take the losses and throw it on the ledger of WCW and pretty much say, hey, yeah, this is a losing proposition, which it's not WCW. It was creative finance, creative account balancing, so to speak, of people within the Turner organization that are not Ted Turner, that did not want WCW as part of the Turner family. And that was their way of pushing them out the door to say, yeah, well, they're losing money, quote unquote. That's not even a real thing.
And there's a lot of things. I mean, like you say that, I agree with you 100%. So I recently read, and I don't really read that many books, but it's a 600-page book. It's great. Can't put it down.
Was it Guy Evans?
Actually a sequel. What? Called
Guy
Nitro.
Evans?
Yes.
Guy Evans has 2 books. Guy Evans, I've heard him talk about this exclusively. I have not read the book.
Yes. But Guy Evans' book Nitro, and he's got a new one. A sequel just came out. I think it's Beyond Nitro.
Yes, they are highly recommended. I've heard both. 83 Weeks is another podcast that's one of the better podcasts in the wrestling space, and he's been on that show multiple times. Like he's and Eric Bischoff, who obviously lived it. He was in it. He was in the trenches, so to speak. He knows it, and Guy Evans' research has been the best research out there of anybody that can cover it. And if and like you just said, you've read it. Here's the thing. He'll tell you right now, WCW wasn't really them losing that money. It was the Turner executives not wanting wrestling as part of it, at a simpler level.
When Ted Turner was directly involved and gave Eric Bischoff the live TV time on Monday nights for Nitro, he's involved and they're succeeding at that point. I think, like you said, Ted Turner in general, like I said, I bring him up to people. His passing today didn't just show up on wrestling. In fact, it probably showed up on less wrestling than other places because of the fact that wrestling, and I think Dave Meltzer actually put out something that was apropos for him and said that he was very integral in the world of wrestling, and wrestling wasn't even something he was integral in. I don't want to essentially quote him, but essentially saying like he was huge in the world of wrestling, and when he dies, if you list 100 things that he's known for, wrestling won't even be one of them. So like that's how many things he was involved in, and yes, he was big in wrestling because he owned WCW. But if you were to ask Ted Turner in 1996, what are you known for? His 2020 interviews or whatever, he never talked about wrestling. He never brought up WCW. Never did anything.
You want to talk mainstream
so much.
You want to talk mainstream, and we won't go down the rabbit hole of this. But just a quick thing, our current president Donald Trump actually put out a very he spoke very highly of Ted Turner. I won't go into the details because people might, not like some of the things that Trump says and whatnot. We're not a political show, but the point is the president of the United States showed a lot of love for Ted Turner. That tells me that's not even just in the wrestling space. That's like entertainment, the president of the United States. Like Ted Turner was very well known, and that's not just, not just in the wrestling world, but just everything.
Well, he was a businessman. He was as Vince McMahon would call him, billionaire Ted.
Well, and the unfortunate part was he lost a lot of his fortune with that AOL Time Warner merger too. He lost billions in that, by the way. I mean, he still was very well off. We know that. I believe he spent like his latter years here in most recent days, before his passing here. I think there was an article that came out maybe a couple months ago that he was spending his years were essentially retired in Montana, fishing, doing the outdoors, like he was enjoying himself, considering he had, I believe it's Lewy body. I'm not a medical person, but he did have some medical issues is what I understood, but he was still trying to be as active as he could. He was outside. He was enjoying the outdoors in Montana. Now, really quick to get back to the business side of it, there are other parts of it that people don't really understand. Like Ted Turner, when he was like kind of like more involved with it, like WCW was doing great business, and it unfortunately he put it in the hands of the wrong people, and that's really what it comes down to.
He can't be everywhere at one time.
They cut funding. Those executives cut funding where Eric Bischoff couldn't keep the talent that he wanted to keep. He couldn't afford it because they were budget cuts. So Eric Bischoff, obviously, everybody that followed the Monday Night Wars, he left because of all that. Like he left initially because of all those issues, on top of other things, but that was part of it. That there's a lot more to it. So like WCW, who knows what would have happened if the executives that didn't like WCW or wrestling in itself, if Ted Turner just was kind of like Tony Khan is today. What would WCW?
WCW, I think, would have been a lot more successful if he was like Tony Khan. And it kind of gets me over to why the WWE, WWF won that war is because you had Vince McMahon, who wasn't known as this, and this. And if you like wrestling, I guess he knows the wrestling
guy.
He was known as wrestling. That was it. I know Vince McMahon kind of took that kind of badly. He wanted to be known as something more than the wrestling guy in those circles with the billionaires and the elites. He kind of, that's why I think he got into the movie side of things, the World Bodybuilding Federation. I think they tried to open the casino. He tried doing a lot of other stuff because he didn't always just be looked at as like, well, wrestling's a circus act, right? Wrestling is the stepchild of modern art, and he didn't like being looked at as the stepchild of the billionaires club. He didn't like going to these things where there's all these well-to-do people, and there's guys who own TV stations, guys who own global companies and jets and banks, and then there's this guy who owns that three-ring circus, like Harlem Globetrotters if. So he didn't like that, but because he was that, and he wasn't doing all this other stuff that makes him the billionaire, is probably why the WWF succeeds, because he was watching the product day in and day out and focused 100% on that product.
Well, when WCW, Eric Bischoff, and obviously Ted Turner behind the scenes writing the big checks, when they're kicking Vince's ass for 83 weeks, that had to wake up Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon is a very competitive person. I think we all know that. And when he was getting his ass kicked for 83 weeks, and honestly, there were weeks here and there. So there's more than 83 weeks, but there was weeks that it was tied or it was close, things like that. The point is, Vince McMahon was against the wall at one point, one time or another. He was against the wall where WCW was the wrestling product. I mean, when I was a kid, WCW was bigger at a certain time than WWE, WWF was, and you know what? It made Vince do things differently, because if he didn't change the way he was doing it at that point when he was getting his ass kicked, guess what? WCW would probably still be around. Let's be honest.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we never really know, but I will say to tie it into the modern day, and how we currently have as we blend over from the passing of Ted Turner to WWE, and it's still in existence form with TKO as the ownership. I do hear the rumblings and the words out there about people saying, it was better when Vince was in charge, or I wish Vince would get it back, or I'm hearing rumors that Vince and the Saudis are going to get together and buy it back. And I think the Ted Turner thing, regardless of health issues, is like a good example of, listen, regardless of what you feel about Vince McMahon, not just personally or professionally, you also have to realize that he's up there in age. So, you're like talking about him coming in, not just, yeah, I think he should buy back WWE. Why would someone who's in their 80s like start a business, because that's what he'd be doing, right? He'd be buying this. He would be going back to work 24 hours a day. He would be like putting his schedule to 365 days a year. If anybody could do it, though,
Vince is the one person I feel like that could do it.
I know, and it's an
anomaly, dude.
It's impossible or anything like that, but it just seems like, listen, if Vince sold his company off in the 50s, when he was in his 50s or his 40s, or let's say in his early 60s, and then there was like rumblings and rumors that he could, maybe want to buy it back or start a new wrestling company. I just think this is just a good example of why, listen, it's a good time for Vince to get out, period. Regardless of if TKO got involved, because again, like, he's not going to live forever. People don't live forever. This week, we saw the play-by-play guy for the New York Yankees, who had been there forever, pass away at about the same age as Ted Turner.
Yeah.
Saw Ted Turner pass away. Like, these people are all about the same age, right? Most people in modern America try to in their 60s, 70s at their latest. But when you're in your 80s, you really, no matter what you're doing, like, you really try to be retired at that age. And for people to think like Vince McMahon should buy it back and should take over his company, like, do you think, like, just thinking about from his perspective, he was involved for so long. If you were Vince McMahon right now and you had been involved for as long as you were, would you even really be interested in that? I'm not going to speak for him. Maybe he is, but it's just like, you do realize that, like,
if I was in his shoes,
you're asking Shane to buy it. You're asking a guy who got out when he should have been retired regardless. I mean, he got kicked out, but hey, if I get sent, if I get sent to jail for something, like Vince McMahon related or not, I hope not, because I'm not like that person. But if anything, I hope it's at 89 years old, because that's about the time that I'm done living anyways, kind of thing. He should just be relaxing, regardless of what the product looks like.
Travel the world and enjoy himself. I know he's traveled the world with WWE and all that. I get that, but like, not working, just kind of enjoying himself.
I don't want to see Vince McMahon back, not because I don't want to see him back as the businessman. It's just like, listen, like, what are we? He can't own it forever, folks, right? I know TKO, a lot of people aren't a big fan of TKO. That's fine. But, hey, if he was to buy it back tomorrow and take over, sooner rather than later, it's going to switch hands again.
I don't think the wrestlers, they're not publicly saying it because that's their employer. But, like, I don't think a lot of the wrestlers are happy about it because they've been asked to take pay cuts. There's been a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes.
Well, it's a whole different organization over there, right?
Yeah, it's different. I mean, there's a lot of rumor and innuendo that two of the names that were asked to take a pay cut are no longer there. That's New Day.
Yes. Yeah. And so from what my understanding is, and staying obviously on the topic of the business and TKO as a company, asking people to take pay cuts, and people are upset about that. I will say, in general, I hate when people tout companies' profits or things like that, and they tout like how much other people make, because it's like, it's not really, like, you got to run a business like a business. If I made $1 billion this year in my business, that doesn't mean that I can still run a bad business. That doesn't mean like, okay, next year everyone gets pizza party every day for the whole year, because money doesn't mean anything. You still have to think responsibly. You still have to think logically.
Oh, don't worry though. Khan and Mari, what is his name? Ari Emanuel. Mm-hmm. If you look at their profits, they're up like over 100%.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's why I say, like, looking at their profits doesn't have anything to do with looking at the New Day's pay, because of the fact that they're different, right? When you own a McDonald's and you work at a McDonald's, those are different. And I guess you can't say, well, you made this much money, you made this much money. It doesn't have anything to do with it.
Well, the problem that people are having is Ari and Khan there. Those two guys are obviously like the bigger fish, so to speak. They're the ones making a ton of money off of WWE, the whole TKO, the property known as WWE. And then you're making so much more money than you were previously. and then you're asking the guys and gals that you're making all that money off their backs. You're asking them to take a pay cut? Absolutely not.
So what I read was the reason for some of these pay cuts was not necessarily based 100% on the financials of we're losing money. It wasn't anything, I don't think, like that. What I think it was is that a lot of these guys made deals that were structured maybe before a couple of years ago.
Yeah, working dates and all that stuff.
Yes.
But here's the thing. At the end of the day,
they're working a lot less. You have to admit that these guys have weekends off.
A deal's a deal.
Every weekend.
If you sign a contract, guess what? If your contract runs until 2027, regardless of what has changed when it comes to live events, this, that, and the other thing.
No, I think you should honor the deal until contracts are up. I agree. If you don't want to renew the new day,
that's just bad business to me. Then so what? So like years from now, say Roman Reigns signs a big contract in the next couple of years, and then they want to change that. Oh, Roman's going to tell him to F off. You know what I mean?
No, I think deals should be honored, right? I mean, this goes back to the Bret Hart giving Vince McMahon giving Bret Hart the 20-year deal, and then like a day into it being like, oh, we can't afford this. I bet you should probably leave for WCW. But yeah, whatever deals you make with someone, you should honor straight through. So if the New Day's contract came up, I could definitely understand it'd be different. But if they were still on a contract and they were still under this as expected pay until their contract is up, and then you renegotiate a new contract, that's different. So I agree that that's not good, right? And I can understand why the New Day might want to leave because of that.
Let's not forget, speaking of the Monday Night Wars, when a bunch of WCW guys were sitting home getting a fat paycheck for a long time, nobody said anything about that. And then once that money ran out, then they came to WWE. Like these things have happened in the past, but guess what? They were still getting their checks, regardless if they were home sitting. Jeff Jarrett was sitting in his boat, chilling out, not working, still getting his money because guess what? The contract signed. You can't just back out on a contract because you're working half the time that you were when we signed the contract. No, the point is you're signed through a certain date.
I agree.
Regardless,
I agree with that.
And the whole thing is ridiculous. To me, that's bad business. That might piss off enough wrestlers when they get their next contract to say, well, you know what? Maybe Tony Khan's better to do business with.
No, and I always wonder too when it comes to like these releases and things like that. I think it's just such a weird time that it's always spring. They're doing these always post WrestleMania.
Oh, of course.
And I always think it's so strange because that is the most profitable time of year. That is the time of year, regardless of what they were doing 2 years ago, where they were literally going out on every Monday Night Raw saying they made more money tonight than they've ever made before. But WrestleMania is that time of year where like what happens at WrestleMania financially and attendance wise and merchandise wise has always been kind of, even going back to like 1998, right? I didn't know how every pay-per-view did, but like WrestleMania 14 buy rates would be in like a Forbes journal or an economics magazine because like that's your most profitable show of the year. That is where you kind of show off, right? It is like, I don't know how many people watch every single NFL football game, but you know how many people watch the Super Bowl because that is like national news. Like that, the profitability, how much money they made, how much like I said, profitability, how many people watched it. Those kind of things are always brought to the forefront when it comes to things like the Super Bowl, maybe not week in, week out, but to those marquee events. So like, I find it very weird that every single year WrestleMania comes out and you've got to be like, how successful was it? How many people attended? How much penetration did you have in the markets and on Twitter and social media? And that's the time of year that like around that time is when you release people. I just think like maybe release them in like the fall when like you're not having to like reveal.
It's weird. It'd be like
it'd
be like in NASCAR, like the Daytona 500 happens. The next day, Kyle Busch is cut. Like Kyle Busch is not racing the next race. You know what I mean? Like, to me, you're right. It makes no sense because you're touting all of this, and then you're cutting people. And the thing is, I get it's a business. I understand that. We've talked about it. There's shareholders involved in this and that and the other thing. I understand that, but some of the ways that TKO does things, I don't want to say it's shady because I don't know if that's the right word, but I just don't think it's right.
I will say this much when it comes to TKO, and I'm not like, and I'll stand by the way we started this, in that I'm not a fan of Vince McMahon returning. A lot of people like to look at Vince McMahon with rose-colored glasses as if he wouldn't do some stupid stuff, like specifically storyline stuff. Like that's up for debate. People talk about storyline stuff like they don't like the stories today, so they think like these people do it better.
Here's the thing.
That's a fluid thing.
Vince always did something funky. And guess what? Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But you know what? I will give Vince his credit from that perspective on a business side, where he wasn't afraid to shoot his shot, so to speak. And
yes, I'm just saying though, do you think like when it comes like, well, Vince would never let, these stories happen, because they don't make any sense. He wouldn't have let The Rock do the thing.
Did a golden egg that led to nowhere. The golden egg with Austin Theory.
Remember, Vince would have this pay-per-view upcoming this weekend be considered WrestleMania Backlash. Remember, he's the person who about a decade or more ago did actually bring up the idea right around the time he was creating films that he could see a future where the WWE was no longer just wrestling, where it was more than just a wrestling ring, that there was more acting and variety and things involved, right? He wanted to have his hands in more than just being a wrestling company. He thought about getting rid of the Survivor Series because he thinks nobody cares about that anymore. That's old. He's the one that wanted to get rid of the Roman numerals from WrestleMania because he thinks that makes it sound old and he wants to make it sound like it's fresh every year. So there's like lots of things. You said the golden egg, right? The most stupendous night in wrestling history, right? That was his tagline for WrestleMania. Like the raging climax. What does that even mean? That sexual innuendo for WrestleMania 15? Why is that the tagline for that event? Like he did.
That was Vince.
Mae Young, right? Giving birth to the hand, right? So there's lots of things in there that you can't just say everything he did was just genius. He did all sorts of stupid stuff. Remember, there's a time where you stopped watching wrestling, not a time where I stopped watching it, but I sure looked at it like even in like 2017, 2015, where you're like, why aren't we giving Shinsuke a better push? You haven't won the Rumble just to lose 3 times in a row to AJ Styles.
There was times in the early to mid 2000s where I had to tune out for a little bit. Like it was, there was times where like, I'm like, this is awful. Like there was some really bad, there were some very lean years that I'm like, I don't get it. And then it's like, obviously like I got sucked back in because obviously we've been doing a podcast for almost 10 years, but there was a time where I was like, I'm going to go watch something else because this is not fun.
Well, why are we having, Rock and Cena main event second year in a row when it makes no sense when CM Punk's your champion and he's going to like leave the company if you don't like promote him like a champion, which he does. So like things like that, there's lots of things when it comes to the business, and so you say about if Ted Turner was still alive, where would WCW be? I mean, that was 26 years ago or 25 years ago, pretty much around this time, 26 years ago, that WCW went out. And I think Ted Turner kind of had his hand out of it a little bit since then, you know what I mean? More than that. So almost 30 years since Ted Turner was really like eyes on WCW. So we don't know where WCW would be. We don't know really anything would be. Nobody foresaw social media, the stuff we're in. But, I will say, looking back with 2020 vision, maybe WCW would be around, but for sure, he was very influential, and he wasn't a nobody in this business. And WCW probably, maybe we'd never have the Attitude Era because WWE wouldn't have had their backs against the wall. Maybe, we wouldn't have had Monday Night Raw ensuring themselves they go live because Bischoff, maybe we wouldn't have Bischoff, right? Because you had Bischoff, but he never was given the creative freedom until he had that meeting with Ted Turner, and Ted Turner says, I'll give you some live TV. And now we know the Eric Bischoff today, the leather jacket motorcycle driving Eric Bischoff, instead of the backstage interviewer that's not really the greatest, gets fired from WWF Bischoff. Who knows? But I know Ted Turner definitely left his mark on the world of professional wrestling. And still to this day, ownership and structure in the wrestling world is still as much of a main topic as it ever was back then when Ted Turner was going against Vince, billionaire Ted against Vince. We're talking about those kind of things with AEW and WWE to this day.